Bueno, vamos a dar comienzo a la siguiente conferencia. Tenemos como panelista, aunque no está aquí físicamente, sino está a través de videoconferencia, a John Verrinder de la EUROSTAT. Aquí está, sí. Con el título de conferencia Plataformas digitales, Experiencia Estadística Europea. John Verrinder es jefe de la Unidad para la Metodología de la Contabilidad Nacional en la EUROSTAT, la Oficina Estadística de la Unión Europea. Ha trabajado en campos relacionados con la contabilidad nacional desde hace casi 20 años a nivel europeo. Entonces, sin más, le vamos a dar la palabra. Yo tengo aquí su presentación. Nada más le pido a John si me va diciendo cuándo quiere que cambie la diapositiva, por favor.
Fantastic. Buenos días and muchas gracias for the invitation to speak here. I've been listening with interest to the discussions in the last minutes, and I hope that we can provide some experience from Europe. I think that a lot of the emphasis here in Europe has been on measuring the so-called collaborative economy. Really, that's been a strong focus of the discussions and the policy interest. So that's predominantly where I'll make my presentation. But I think I would complement certainly the comments that have been made in the last few minutes that we in Europe also have not found so far a so-called smoking gun, that the national accounts measures that we have are deeply challenged by digitalisation. However, what we do see is that there are both challenges and opportunities to practical measurement, the opportunities being the much broader availability of data, the challenges being to follow economic activity into new areas. And at the same time, we know that we need to complement the kind of data such as GDP with other relevant indicators if we want to make them in a context which the users can appreciate. We've been doing this for many years for environmental issues, and undoubtedly there is a demand for digital information. So these were my points of introduction. Perhaps the next slide, please, just to... Thank you very much. So what we see here, and I guess what you all see, is the impact of digitalisation, not just on businesses to consumers, but also businesses to businesses and consumers to consumers. And this is where I mentioned this issue of the collaborative economy, households using their existing assets, such as their apartments, houses, or their cars, to produce services for other households. And we also see, as Paul has explained, new goods and services which are coming very quickly onto the market. We need to follow their quality, and in particular, how to capture what happens in our price statistics and our volume measures. If we look specifically at digital platforms, and I'm thinking here of the collaborative platforms such as Airbnb and Uber, in general, we find in Europe they are not yet explicitly estimated in different statistics. And as I'll explain in a second, partly that's because of different legal situations, but also different availability of people to talk to from these companies in the different countries. We are very familiar with the big, often US-based, but not necessarily, platforms. But of course, we in Europe have found a proliferation of different kinds of platforms in areas which you would never have expected. Delivery of food, the list is very, very long about the kind of innovations that we see. So, if we look at the next slide, in terms of the different statistical domains, obviously there's a big interest on national accounts, GDP, and the balance of payments for these macro data. But in fact, there are many different kinds of statistics where we see the impacts of digitalization coming through. And indeed, what we found in Europe is the importance of the communication between these domains and avoiding that different areas of statistics approach enterprises, digital-based enterprises, in a very uncoordinated way. This really doesn't help the work that we do. So we are looking with business statisticians in particular, price statisticians, those measuring both consumer and producer prices, the employment data, which I'll come back to, which actually is sometimes highly challenged by these types of digitally based collaborative working, and also other domains where they've been impacted by digitalization, such as in tourism or in transport services. So these are areas where it's not just about is GDP fit for purpose, but it's a whole range of information that is impacted in official statistics by digitalization. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of these statistical challenges, they are very great that we found. And in fact, it's really only in the last few years that statistical offices in Europe have started to really focus on this digitalization agenda. First of all, there is indeed the issue of the data gap. You know, what kind of information do we have available and where can we get it from? And I think that the cross-border in that first bullet is really important because we already have problems to measure these globally spread enterprises which can move intellectual property around very easily for business or for taxation reasons. And the digitalization adds another complexity to that. So many of these digital firms or digitally active firms are also the ones where we have problems to track and break down by country what they're doing. There are also issues of the methodology and the scope. I'll come back to that. And finally, the issue of data collection in practice. And I think that, first of all, we see a lack of relevant registers for these types of platforms. We know that all the companies that have to be formed, at least nationally, are actually in our business registers. But what we don't have is the code that says these are the digitally relevant enterprises that we should consider. The second issue is the issue of collecting data. I'll come back to this. There's an issue of data transmission, how to get data, and there's also a strong issue of data confidentiality. And finally, there is a demand from users, in fact, for a mix of indicators. We see within Europe that many active users here, they want a mix of indicators from different domains of statistics, some from business statistics, some from national accounts, some for employment, but they want a mixture of information which we have to provide. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, we actually see a wide variety of business models within Europe, and that complicates matters as well. So, for example, the digital can be based on fees, where information can be collected. As Paul has mentioned and you've discussed, advertising, subscription-based models or retail models. So there are different kinds of business models that we see behind these platforms, and one of the big conceptual questions is really, do we represent them in the same way, or do we change the way that we represent them in our statistics depending on the model? We also have the issue of profits. There's still a lot of not-for-profit operations that have been started up, particularly at local level. But also we then start to get into where do these companies make their profits from as part of their business model. So we see a huge variety of different models in Europe, and I guess you also see them in your country as well. Next slide, please. So what kind of practical work have we been doing in Europe? And I'll focus particularly on the collaborative economy. And here, in fact, it's not just a statistical issue, as has been mentioned before. It is a very strong policy issue as well. European policymakers at European level, as well as national level, are really thinking about how these collaborative economy platforms can be well regulated? How do they fit into the overall structure of EU and national legislation? And in fact, one of the nice things about the policy agenda is that we as statisticians can talk to the policymakers, and we can start to push for things that we're interested in. So, for example, in the policy communication last year, statisticians managed to get in the idea that these platforms should cooperate to facilitate access to data and statistical information. Of course, subject to confidentiality issues. And I think there is a sort of general access to privately held data question, which I'll raise in a second in another slide. We at Eurostat tentatively started to take contact with some companies, for example with Airbnb, which have been ongoing. Actually, on the one side, they've been very friendly. On the other side, there is a difficulty about reaching the ultimate decision makers, the guys who actually can say yes or no, we want to proceed to some kind of common project with you. But we had some good discussions. We had an idea of what the data were held. And one of the nice things is these companies already have data scientists working within them. So in fact, when you talk to them, and you ask them, do you have these kinds of data available? They more or less turn around to you and say, what, your question is so simple, we have huge amounts of data and we're very good at using it for commercial purposes. In other words, these are not companies who are shy about actually analysing and using fully the data that they have. In 2017, this year, we set up a network of country statistical offices here to start to exchange experience on measuring this collaborative economy, this part of the digital economy which is involved in exchanges between, predominantly between households, but also business to household. And indeed, we identified the major concerns that they had, and we encouraged the countries to contact 10 or more platforms of different sizes to try to actually get something moving in terms of contacts with these platforms. Next slide, please. So one of the key points in all of this, I guess, is, and I think you'll see later in your discussions and your program, is, well, where do we get this kind of data from? And of course, the magic bullet, the holy grail, would be a good access to the data that the platforms hold themselves. As I said earlier, they are experienced data compilers and users. If statisticians would get access to these types of data, whether in a microdata sense or in a granular data sense, then this would actually give us a fantastic information source about consumer or about, let's say, household-to-household types of transactions facilitated through these platforms. Transaction-level data, basically, which is fantastic. Of course, there's another way of getting this information, and that is to ask the individual households through surveys and so on. But even though this is done in many countries, there are questions added to regular surveys of households and businesses. This is piecemeal, it's subject to all the usual problems of non-response and so on. And therefore, clearly, making investment in dealing with the platforms would be a very good way to go. However, as I said, where platforms are locally based, one can have generally a pretty good dialogue. But where platforms are internationally based, it becomes very slow and sometimes difficult progress. Now, many European national statistical institutes have asked for a common approach to access privately held data. So, in other words, how can statisticians actually get access to the data in a way which either is voluntary but structured, or even eventually legally binding upon these types of enterprises, for example. Now this raises for us very important questions, not just in terms of the legal questions and privacy, but also cost, and also the issue of data exchange for statistical purposes. Because what you realize when you talk to these companies is that they have a central point for collecting data on transactions. So why should we have to go at national level and ask, can I have the data for the UK? Can I have the data for France? When actually all of these data are often within one large database or a distributed database within the company itself. So this raises some really interesting questions about who collects these data. Should it be collected in some kind of central point, perhaps where the head office is located? Or should it still be distributed amongst the countries to try their luck? And clearly central collection is probably most efficient and easier for the companies or the enterprises to deal with. But at the same time, it raises a question about how that data can be properly shared to respect privacy and also to deal with collaboration between statistical offices. But this kind of data exchange question is not just about digital platforms. It's a general question about globalized enterprises. It's a problem that we face even for companies which are less digital but are spread across many countries in their operations. Trying to have consistent data is very important. Next slide, please. So there are some strong conceptual questions to be resolved here, and actually, as I say on the slide, these are not just statistical issues, these are also in many countries legal issues as well. We can read about cases in our courts across the world where these types of platforms are under pressure to actually declare that their activities are not just pure intermediation, but in fact they have some responsibility towards the people providing these services. For example, Airbnb or Uber are subject to a lot of discussion in many countries about what exactly their business model implies for taxes, social contributions and things like this. However, I think conceptually, when we record within statistics, I think Paul mentioned this briefly somewhere, we need to see whether these types of platforms are pure intermediaries. Are they simply there to charge a small fee for acting in the middle between one household which provides accommodation and another household which consumes that accommodation? Or are the platforms actually more than that? Are they actually, can we see Uber, for example, as a taxi company and not just as an intermediary, just providing a digital platform to do so? So it's not just a statistical question, but how we answer that question has some pretty significant implications for the kind of statistics that we produce. Maybe not in aggregate, not in a GDP sense, but in the sense of breakdowns of industries, breakdowns of employment, and the other data which analysts are interested in. So we have that question, and we have that question when we record in so-called current prices, when we record in our own currencies, without moving on to the problem of what to do with the prices and how to take out the prices to get the development of the volume of these services. So it is a two-step process. How do we represent these business models in our statistics? And based on that, what is the most appropriate way to measure and indeed to compile volume estimates for these types of activities? Next slide, please. So if we take a case, say, of Uber, you can think of many, many different ways of thinking about the way that Uber operates. As a taxi company with self-employed drivers, well, we've seen this before. This is not an uncommon model that we've seen for decades. Or a taxi company with employees, or intermediation services, and then to who? Who is Uber providing services to? The taxi drivers, or to the households, or both? So you can see in a way how do we think about these things is actually very important. Next slide, please. In terms of the second question, and I'm drawing an example, I think you have a colleague from the CBS, from the Netherlands, talking later on, if I read correctly the program. But another question, which is, what about Airbnb? How do we visualize Airbnb in this type of model? And in fact, you can see that perhaps it's the households themselves who are producing the accommodation services. They're partly exporting these services to foreign tourists. You see the commission, which is paid to Airbnb in their business model, as a kind of intermediate consumption, which means that, in fact, the producers of the accommodation services, the households who are producing these services, are actually paying for an intermediation service of Airbnb. A bit like a kind of a payment that they may have, a hotel would make to a travel agency or something like this. And they're importing that service if we believe that Airbnb is located outside of their country, which for most countries is true. But then we have an issue, and I think this is an important point, and this is a point also I think Paul alluded to, is we have to make sure that whatever we do, we don't double count what's already happening. So, for example, in our national accounts, we already have an estimate of the output for owner-occupied housing or owner-occupied dwelling. So we already say that if you own a house, we make an imputation in the accounts as if you were renting it to yourself. But of course, if you're actually renting your house, at least for some time in the year, to somebody else, then you have to ensure that you're not double counting what's going on. So digitalization can, indeed in Europe we have discussed in a number of cases, to avoid double counting, to avoid impacting upon our existing measures in an unwelcome way. Next slide, please. And then we have a nice, interesting question, which actually we were discussing in a working group this morning here in Europe that I was chairing, which is the issue of what we call outlet substitution. And this is really a kind of an interesting issue because it's not new in the sense of we've always seen this drift in the way in which we buy things. From small corner shops to larger supermarkets to hypermarkets. But now we have the trend towards online shopping as well. And even if in many countries the proportion of consumer expenditure made digitally is still relatively small, it is growing fast, as we well know. So then we have an issue of we see rather different prices between the physical shops and the online shops. Often the online shops are cheaper, not always the case. How do we treat the price differences between these outlets? How do we treat the quality issues? So it's not a new problem. It's been around for decades in consumer price measurement, also in national accounts volume measurement. But still, we face this with the online shops, and indeed, we have to start thinking about what part of price differences are volume. That is, they're actually in terms of a quantity of the good or service that you receive, and how much of it is just the fact that onliners are keener on prices. And indeed, I want a bit of humour here amongst statisticians. If we can't come to some kind of agreement, what do we do? Do we put it all as volume, all as price, or do we just say 50-50? And that's the kind of discussion I think that we're going to be having certainly in Europe and I think worldwide in the coming months and maybe years. So, in a sense, these e-platforms that we've seen are changing the intermediaries. For travel, for example, you don't often go to the physical travel agency around the corner, but you may go online. But of course, the traditional intermediaries are fighting back. They're creating an online presence, and they are trying to take back what they believe the platforms are taking away from them. But still, we have this issue about these digital products. We have the issue of, are they different? Are they new products because of the way in which you buy them and you investigate them? Or are indeed they just traditional products through a different outlet with a different price? And one of the debates you could have, coming back to the example of Uber, for example, is your taxi experience or your transport experience better when you have the use of the Uber application and you can pay by credit card and everything else? Or is it worse than a traditional taxi service which you've called up on the telephone and they turn up and so on? And that's an interesting debate. Are you getting more service from an online platform than you would through a traditional outlet? So even if the price is less, you may still be getting more service. And this is a big debate which we're talking through right now. So if I may summarize, that was indeed my last slide, but if I may summarize the experience within Europe, the fact is that there's a lot of interest across different domains of statistics for this. It's not just about national accounts and GDP and so on, but we are taking a strong interest in this. It is about, as I've said, very much a focus at the moment on these collaborative platforms. Worldwide, as Paul has alluded to, of course, there's advisory group and there's all kinds of discussions on an international level. But within Europe, a lot of our focus has been on these collaborative platforms, household to household, and the price development and how we can actually track price developments in these types of digital products and platforms. Thank you very much for listening to the presentation, and of course I'd be happy to answer questions and join in the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for your presentation. Entonces vamos a abrir ahora un espacio para preguntas y respuestas. ¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta? Well, I do. I have a. Okay. No, you start, please.
Hi, John. This is Marshall Reinsdorf. I'm just wondering, we talk about, okay, if there's a, hey, oh, we can see your face. Your last topic on outlet substitution bias, of course, is something I've thought about for a while, back when. And then I wonder, is there any evidence on the price differentials, whether online prices are really cheaper? I kind of remember one thing by, was it Cavallo, right, in Rigobon, saying there's not a whole lot of difference. I don't know if you, because we're talking about what do we do with it, I wonder, do you have any idea how big this problem even is quantitatively?
Otra pregunta allá atrás.
Hi, John. This is Tim Sturgeon from MIT. I'm very interested in your comments about recruiting the platform companies to help with kind of data production and data analysis. And I was in a meeting a couple of weeks ago in Brussels where a guy from Google was there, and he said he hadn't really been. It's again this attitude of very friendly, but you wonder what it would need to do to get to yes. One thing that struck me about your comments, though, was your interest in their microdata or their very granular data. It seems like that would be the exact thing they wouldn't want to do because that's their customer data. So this is their kind of their gold. So why not kind of higher level estimates, aggregates, disclosable statistics on the fly? I mean, because they have so much data all the time. They could really deliver timely data. So, if you have a different approach where you kind of back off the desire to get the actual data and the fine-grained data to do the calculations yourself, and trade that for higher level disclosable statistics that are provided on an ongoing basis. It seems like that approach might be better for both parties.
Yeah, and a similar question along these lines that I had is, what makes these companies want to share their information? I mean, what kind of incentives can you give them to make them want to share? And in this context, what would confidentiality mean? And how would you preserve confidentiality? ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Rolando.
This is Rolando Campo from INEGI, and what I want to ask is from the European Union, do you think it's possible to have an agreement with these companies like Uber or Airbnb to obtain from them some kind of a structure of information that can be used for us without taking care of the confidentiality and all those issues? So I understand that now, so they get into the market with any statistical process or any, without thinking that they are they need to be measured by the GDP or some issues. So in this sense, for the statisticians, is there a way to ask them to have more formally, to have a structure of the information?
Okay, John, I think we're going to give you the mic this time.
Thank you very much for your questions. And in fact, you're very much focused on the idea of how to get data and how to deal with data from platforms. But first of all, in answer to Marshall, in terms of the price differences, within national accounts we haven't been doing too much, but I know that our colleagues in the price statistics area have been looking at this in some cases. And in particular, they've been looking at things like travel agencies and booking online travel, for example. But you're right, when I said earlier that it's not always that online is cheaper. From what I've heard from the experience of our CPI colleagues, the fact is that something can be equally or more expensive online as in your corner agency. But certainly, you're right that this preconception that everything is cheaper online needs to be tested actually with better data. But from what I've heard anecdotally from our CPI colleagues, particularly in the travel area, this is not always the case. I think that in terms of Tim's comment, in fact, you're absolutely right. When I mentioned in the presentation, I talked about microdata or granular data. And in fact, that's part of the exploration. It's very unlikely that these platforms will just dump all their microdata on you. And in fact, I'm not sure we could handle it if they did. But the idea of can we get from them tabulations, can we get from them the information more aggregated, which doesn't compromise their concerns over the confidentiality of individual microdata transactions, but at the same time gives us what we want. And actually, we had some discussions, for example, with Airbnb along these lines, and they were very open to this. They said that, look, we have our data scientists, we are very, very flexible on how we handle data inside our house, and so, in fact, we could do this. So I think that there is a compromise here to be struck between statistical needs, which aren't always about microdata, and the confidentiality and the willingness or not of these platforms to share data. Of course, when I mention microdata, there are actually a lot of people out there who would be interested in microdata for research or for social purposes. The microdata could actually be rather interesting. But I think you're absolutely right that if we push too hard we may get nothing, and perhaps a compromise is the way forward. And in terms of the incentives for the companies, initially the companies have been rather friendly, as has been said, but they also have some interest in collaboration, because they know that the statistics that we will prepare will be better, and they are users of our statistics in one way or the other. So they do recognize that helping us to improve the quality of data can help them as a user of data as well. Of course, they are interested in getting some kind of privileged access as well to information that we may hold, and that contravenes our confidentiality. So eventually it's a kind of negotiation, but so far, at least in terms of once we find a good person to talk to, they're friendly, they're open, but it is a slow process to reach a point where they may be able to provide data on a regular basis. And I think this alludes to the other questions about how can we reach an agreement with them, and at what level do we reach an agreement with them. In fact, in some cases, when we talk to these companies, talking through the statistical offices where their head offices are based has actually been quite fruitful. So rather than running around in a country where a platform operates, but where it doesn't have its head office, to actually contacting through a national statistical office where the head office is located is also proved quite fruitful for European-based platforms. So, for example, a platform may be based in the Netherlands, and in fact, talking through the Dutch statistical office with the platform is actually a good way in, rather than trying to talk to their German branch or their UK branch or something like this. So it's not just about getting agreement, but it's also about finding a channel or a way in where you can actually reach a point where you can have a constructive discussion with them. And that's what my colleagues here are spending some time doing. So, I mean, I hope I've sort of addressed the questions that you have, but it is a rather, as I said, slow process. We've invested here in Eurostat in terms of staff and in terms of grants that we make available to countries to try to push them, to help them to talk. So it is a process which will take quite some time, even if the users want the answers really now, but we have to be a little bit patient and take step by step.
Thank you, John. Here's one more question it came through internet, and it's by Mario Resendiz. So it says, how do you distinguish or classify within an electronic or digital commerce an intermediary of a producer of services? ¿Hay alguna otra pregunta que quisieran aprovechar para hacer de una vez? No, so this would be the last question.
Yeah, this is actually a very nice question, because it relates to what is the industrial, or what is the classification of the industry of these types of platforms. One part of the answer, of course, comes back to my slides, which is if you see these platform companies as pure intermediaries, we already have parts of our industry classification that are dealing with pure intermediaries. You know, we already travel agencies have existed for many, many years, and so we tend to look for intermediaries into the existing classification. If you see these companies as actually providing the services, such as transport services or accommodation services, then this is clearly the place where you think they should be classified. So there is, first of all, a question about how do you see these companies. The second question, though, is one of the way in which the intermediation is being delivered, or the services are being delivered. So when we talk about intermediation, it can be physical, it can also be online. What we don't have generally in our classifications is the mode or the way in which this service is actually delivered. And I think that's an area which for some we do, but generally it's not there. And that, I think, makes it quite hard for us to just pick out from our existing information, yes, this enterprise, yeah, that's definitely operating in a digital way when it operates within a traditional industry. So, to briefly answer the question, if you consider these types of platforms to be intermediaries, then often you can find a place for them as intermediaries within the existing classification. If you consider them to be delivering the services themselves, then clearly we have transport, we have accommodation, we have those types of services as well. So I think the classification issue is really about how you perceive the business model. Then, of course, you may come across completely new lines of activity which you never thought of before. And indeed, I think this is an area where the next upgrade of the relevant classifications will have to take careful notice. For example, recently I know that at worldwide level they've been discussing how we classify consumption products, how we classify the consumptions by the purpose to which they're put. And there we already start to see some modernization in terms of these new digital services appearing within the classifications. So I think that as classifications develop over time, we will have perhaps finer detail on the new services and the existing services, but for the moment we're trying to piece them into the existing classification.
Thank you very much, John. Vamos a darle un aplauso y